everyone. Welcome to our virtual recording of the Allyship training. This is a new training that the Davis Center has created, and we hope that you'll be able to easily access it on our website. My name is Aseel Abulhab, and I'm a Williams 15 and the Postgraduate Inclusion Fellow at the Davis Center. I'm joined by our wonderful Community Engagement Fellow, Shiara, who will introduce herself in a minute. I just wanted to let you all know a little bit about this training and this video and where you can access it at any time. So this is a new training that we've created. We have a number of different trainings at the Davis Center, and including Social Identity 101, Power and Group Dynamics, and now Allyship. We hope that this training will be something that is easily accessible by everyone and something that you don't have to request in advance. So you can find it on our website. And which is linked in the PowerPoint. At the end of this presentation, you will see that, and you'll also learn a little bit more about the Davis Center and what we do and how we can support you. So today we'll have Shiara, who co-created this training, lead it, and I will be her trusty audience member, ready to ask questions. But please know that even though I'll be asking some questions that I anticipate you all might be having, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time if you do have any questions or would like to debrief this training in more detail. So I'm going to turn it over to Shiara, who's going to introduce herself and then get us started with the PowerPoint.
Okay, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see that?
I can.
Okay, let me go all the way to the front. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Shiara Pyrrhus. I am class of 2023, and I'm a community engagement fellow for the Davis Center, which pretty much means that I lead workshops and trainings like this, and it can be requested by student groups and any student. If you want to be educated about anything, we have a lot more workshops, but I was really excited to work with Aseel to create this Allyship workshop because I know Allyship is something complex, and in the climate that we live in, it's also a really important topic that we all need to be educated on. So I'm excited to get into this with you all. So welcome to the Allyship workshop presented by the Davis Center. We start all our workshops with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Williams College and Williamstown are built upon the ancestral lands of the Mohican and Mohawk people. We acknowledge that Williams College benefits from a history of colonialism and that this colonization continues to this present day. So guidelines for this conversation. So everyone understand that this is a learning space. No one knows everything, but together we come to know and can learn. Even I'm presenting this, I don't know everything. I'm no expert on allyship. Assume good intentions. Speak from your own experiences and avoid generalizations. So use I statements. We learn the most when we challenge ourselves to step out of our comfort zones. And our comfort zones look different. So engaging in a conversation we are unfamiliar with, supporting others in their learning process, listening to understand the experiences of others or through examples. So the goals for this workshop. So participants will be able to define and explore terms, including ally, accomplice, and co-conspirator. You will be able to identify the risks and the importance of being an ally and also understand the nuances and connections between all those different terms. And you will specifically learn ways to be an ally within the Williams community as a college student. So we're going to start off with some definitions. We're going to talk about being an ally, accomplice versus being a co-conspirator. We're going to explore allyship, the risks and importance of being an ally. We're going to explore effective allyship, so ways to be an ally on campus. And finally, we're going to end with scenarios and sword and shield activity that you can do whenever you'd like. So we're going to start off by defining ally. So ally is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and traditionally oppressed groups of people. So I really like those three words: trust, consistency, and accountability. So it's a lot of really looking into yourself. So acknowledging when you're wrong. And also it takes a lot of effort. You have to be consistent. You have to do it multiple times. So allyship is an active practice that requires action, right? So it's very active. It's not passive at all. Allyship requires an understanding and self-awareness around power and privilege, which we will get into. Allyship's purpose is to achieve equity and inclusion. And allyship requires us to hold ourselves accountable to advancing marginalized people's needs. So accomplice is another term that you might hear. So the accomplice framework challenges the morality of the legal system. So just because a practice is legal and lawful does not mean it is moral and just. Therefore, in order to achieve equity, sometimes laws must be broken. That's what accomplices believe. So for example, segregation in the US was legal and unjust. There are so many examples of people of all races breaking laws to integrate society and work to advance equity during segregation. So the concept of accomplishment is necessary as local and national laws and practices are still created to disenfranchise and marginalize different groups of people. Therefore, folks who are able to be accomplices and take on risks associated with breaking the law to achieve equity are needed. So you might also hear co-conspirator. So the line between co-conspirator and accomplice are blurred. They're very, very similar. But I can just go through the definition of this one, which is another term that you might hear. So co-conspirator functions as a verb, not a noun. So co-conspirators work toward and understand the following. So they understand where we stand in relation to systems of privilege and oppression, and unlearning the habits and practices that protect those systems, which is lifelong work for all of us without exception. So authentic relationships of solidarity and mutuality, which are not possible when we try to avoid or transcend power imbalances. Honestly acknowledging and confronting those imbalances to create authentic relationships. Social change work is always rooted in collaboration, humility, and accountability. And the interior work into silence, meditation, inner wisdom, and deep joy is intricately linked to the outer work of social change. So we're going to dig into some of these terms and explore these their connections. So I just want to acknowledge that we do use allyship, the word ally, throughout this presentation because one, it's one that you're probably the most familiar with. I always hear it in social media, the media. So for our purposes, it's the general word that we use to encompass all these words. So in our for this workshop, so when we talk about an ally, we also refer to accomplice or co-conspirator, but we wanted to go into these terms because they're, to some other people, they mean completely different things, and we wanted to make sure that you understand what they mean if you hear them in other contexts. And this is not to say that ally is a bad word at all. That's like weird. That's why we're using it, because it's not. It's just there is debate within these words, and one reason that ally has received pushback is because people believe that it grants others to be passive, but with all these terms, action is needed. So let's talk about the difference between allies, accomplice, and co-conspirators. So an ally will mostly engage in activism by standing with an individual or group in a marginalized community. An accomplice will focus more on dismantling the structures that oppress that individual or group, and such work will be directed by the stakeholder in the marginalized group. So this isn't a perfect metaphor, but some might argue that like being an ally is like putting the band-aid on a wound, as opposed to like really trying to like heal or suture the wound or get surgery for the wound. So accomplice or co-conspirator might be argued that they are dismantling the system because they understand that you can't just put a band-aid on a system that isn't broken but is working intentionally. Like the system was created to work exactly how it's working, and you can see that it's very flawed and it's hurting a lot of people. In an example, an ally will volunteer at a local racial justice focused organization, while an accomplice would join an organization with an explicit aim of naming and disrupting racial injustice. But again, we use ally to encompass all these words, and there's nothing wrong with being an ally as long as you're taking action and not being passive. So again, some examples, the distinction that you might hear about ally and accomplice. So ally is typically considered a verb. One needs to act as an ally and cannot bestow this title to themselves. The action of an ally have greater likelihood to challenge institutionalized racism and white supremacy. An ally is like a disruptor and educated in spaces dominated by whiteness. And we will later on this workshop talk about how allyship should not be an identity. Being an ally is not an identity that we hold. And then you have accomplice / co-conspirator. So the actions of a accomplice are meant to directly challenge institutionalized racism, colonization, and white supremacy by blocking or impeding racist people, policies, and structures. Realizing that our freedoms and liberations are bound together, retreat or withdraw in the face of oppressive structures is not an option. So, I bet you're all wondering, what am I? So these are terms that continue to be debated among folks doing social justice work. It is important to understand how these terms have been conceptualized, but not to get hung up on these definitions or labels. So at its core, being an ally, accomplice, co-conspirator is all about action. So taking effective action requires a deep understanding of social identity, power, and privilege, which we will talk about both these things later on. These actions are part of creating a more just and equitable society. So being an ally is not an identity that we get to claim. It is an invitation to consistently challenge ourselves to actively show up for others who lack power and privilege we hold. Instead of asking, what am I? Think, what can I do and how can I do it better, right? So if you're consistently putting in these works, you don't have to worry. The people that you're showing up for, the marginalized groups, will see you as an ally. You don't have to, it's not an identity that you necessarily get to claim or like brag about. People will see who's showing up and act accordingly. So in order to understand how to be an ally, you have to, you have to understand your power and privilege to be the most effective ally you can be. You have to do some reflection on social identity categories and reflect individually on these categories and how within these categories you might have some privilege, while other ones you might have marginalized identity. So the Davis Center does offer a more comprehensive workshop on social identity. It's called Social Identity 101. So if you're interested in that, you can also learn more about that. But for our own purposes, we're going to go through these slides a little faster. So social identity categories, we in American society, so we have race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, religion, physical ability, mental ability, and emotional ability. We also have citizenship status / country of origin, age, other social group membership. One social identity category is sex. And we usually like to explain that with the gender unicorn. So the most important thing about this image of the gender unicorn is how you can see that at sex assigned at birth that the circles are closed in, right? So for female, male, other, intersect, and that means that is very rigid, right? Like you that's not fluid at all, because that's a moment in time, like the doctor saw you and assigned your sex, right? But every other category, whether it's gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, emotional attraction, the circle at the beginning is open, which means that all of these are very, very fluid. So that's just one example. We also like to talk about the social identity wheel, so you can further explore these identities and really think about who you are and where you might hold some privilege or not, and also think about where some of these categories are, like for example, like the social identity wheel is like a pie or a circle, and some of these categories you think about more often in different spaces, right? And Aseel will go through her example. This is Aseel's social identity wheel, and these are some questions for reflection, right? So what identities do you think about most often, least often? Do you think the focus of these identities shift based on context? For example, what identities are you most aware of with your friends, in class, at a party or social event, at home with your family? And Aseel did a great job doing a social identity wheel for home versus Williams, and I'll let her talk more about that.
Thank you so much, Shiara, and thank you for setting that up so nicely. So yeah, we of course we're all intersectional beings, right? We all hold multitudes of identities, and our relationships with those identities are constantly changing. And the purpose of the social identity wheel is to get us to think about context, right? To get us to think about how we identify particular social identity categories and how we show up in different spaces and what kind of privileges we have or don't have in those spaces, because those change based upon context, even though we are intersectional beings with all of these identities that we're always holding. So I just did one example here of Home versus Williams, and I tried to think of Williams when I was a student, not from the staff perspective, but Home. So whatever home means to you, right? And you can do this in many different, and the questions that you had in the other slide, Shiara, goes into thinking about even within Williams or even within home, right? Like with your immediate family, with extended family, being at a party versus being in the classroom. All of these are different contexts, but we tried to go a little bit general for these purposes. So home, and I put or with family. So you can see the size of the sections of the pie show how much these affect the way these are the identities I think most about, right? Or affect the way I show up in the space. So I have here that for me, the things I think most about when I'm with my family are my gender and gender sex, and then also my citizenship status. And you'll see it's hard to read in the corner there. Don't worry about what I wrote in the bottom. But basically, most of my extended family are refugees, and I am not. And so when I'm with my extended family, I think a lot about the privilege that I hold as an American citizen. And I also think about being a woman, just in terms of different cultural considerations. I think a little bit about sexual orientation. I think some about my age, right? I think about how I relate to folks in my family who are older, and how that affects the way I show up in that space. I think about ability status often, and so that's just from home. And then at Williams, you see it's very different, right? So the things that I think most about are quite different. So I have religion here, and I put especially in social settings. So I identify as a Muslim, and when I was at Williams, there is a culture of going to parties and people drinking, right? And I don't drink because of my religion, and so that's something that I thought a lot about in social space, right? Also race and ethnicity, going to a predominantly white institution is something I thought a lot about, and socioeconomic status, and that includes a lot of things. That includes socioeconomic background, and then of course we all have certain access to resources because we're all Williams students. So you can see how drastically different. Now, I hold all these identities in all the spaces that I'm in, but what I think most about changes based on either the ways in which I do have privilege in a particular identity. I gave some examples of that, and also the ways in which I don't have privilege in some of my identities. And I gave some examples of that. So we encourage you to fill out your own social identity wheels, and use it, to reflect on your own identities, and how that might show up for you in different spaces, in Williams and beyond.
Yes. Thank you so much, Aseel, for sharing. Yes, we encourage you to do this at home or when you have some time, because it's important to understand your social identity, those categories, and how they differ in different spaces, and also reflect on the power and privilege some of these social identity categories may allot you. Okay. So this is all to say that identity is extremely complicated, right? We contain multitudes of identities that are constantly changing and interacting with one another, and influence how we interact with other people. So the interaction of our various identities are further complicated by the fact that some social identities have been treated as in-groups, right? Or groups that historically have privileges, while others are treated as out-groups, or groups that have historically marginalized or been oppressed. So privilege, marginalization, and oppression. So privilege is defined as having a special right, advantage, or immunity available only to a particular person or a group of people. So it is complex and constantly subject to change based on where you are, who you're with, and other circumstances. So like someone that might have privilege in America might not have privilege in Australia, because societies differ. So in other words, privilege is relative. So marginalization and oppression refers both to the absence of privilege and historical outgroups' experiences of indirect and direct violence, discrimination, and inhibited access to resources. So being oppressed or marginalized is not only about not having privilege, but also not having the resources or access to a lot of things that others with privilege might have, and also maybe potentially being harmed for that identity. So it's a lot deeper. So examples of privilege. So for example, societal accommodation as privilege. So as a cisgendered woman or person whose identity aligns with the sex, my sex assigned at birth, I know that every building will have a bathroom I feel comfortable using. An example of special rights as privilege. So before 2015, only straight couples had the federal enforced right to marriage and the social, economic, and political benefits of matrimony. An example of immunity as privilege. So as a US citizen, I am immune to prosecution or surveillance from ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So we will talk about systems of privilege and oppression. So we talked about the social identity categories before, and then we're going to talk about the systems of oppression and the systems of privilege. So when you think about race, the system of oppression for race is racism, while the systems of privilege is white supremacy. When you think about gender/sex, system of oppression is sexism or cism, while the systems of privilege is patriarchy or cisgender privilege. And for example, we can go down to age. Social identity category is age. System of oppression is ageism. Systems of privilege is young / and middle-aged adults. So now we're going to talk about power.
Shiara, so sorry to interrupt you. Will you just go back one slide? I just want to make one note here.
No problem.
So you see like cis sexism, right, and heterosexism. You may have heard the terms, these are more used terms, homophobia and transphobia. We don't have that on this list here, but those refer to the same thing. There's some debate about whether or not to use the terms transphobia or homophobia. So we have these other terms here instead, but I just wanted to, in case that was something that folks are more familiar with, that those are the same thing. And the main takeaway from this slide is that systems of privilege are the folks who hold privilege in a society that has that system of oppression that's corresponding to it. And so thank you so much for explaining that, letting me just jump in for a second.
Of course, thank you. Anytime. Okay. So we're going to talk about power and privilege. So I was so excited when I found this example at another workshop and am able to bring it to you all. So think of power and privilege as your sword and shield. So the privileged social identities you hold are your shield, right? They protect you from the oppression other people face. But your sword is your ability to fight back and show up for those that don't have privileges. So we all hold privileges, and it's based on different contexts, again, like who you're with, what you're doing, what space you're inhabiting. And the more we are of those privileges, the more effective allies we can be. So the more power and privilege we hold in our social identities based on race, class, sex, all of it, the more opportunities we have to show up for those without those privileges. So we all have a responsibility to do this because we all in some way hold some power and privilege based on or different identities. So I want to go through an example of this. So someone who identifies as a male doesn't have to worry about being interrupted or having ideas stolen in the classroom. So in this case, his power and privilege is the shield, right? It protects him. And it protects him from experiences of sexism. While his sword is his ability to make space for a student that identifies as a woman. So making sure that like she gets time to speak, or making sure to not interrupt or mansplain, things like that. And that sword is a small act that limits her experience of sexism. So we're going to talk about risks of being an ally. So we would love that if at the end of this presentation, everyone signs up to be an ally, but in order to make a decision, I think it's really important that you understand everything that comes with it. So it's important to be an ally, you have to make a lot of sacrifices, such as your comfort, reputation, energy, time, and a lot more. It is inconvenient. If it was convenient, it would be easy and everyone would sign up to be an ally, which is not the case. You have to constantly attack the very systems that benefit you. And you make a lot of mistakes, and that's also really hard. But we all make mistakes, and that is no reason to not take any action. And there are some physical risks. We will talk about an example of how an ally can put themselves in physical danger. These struggles are real, and allies should understand these risks. However, if you're ever grappling with these struggles, remember, people with marginalized identities have faced greater risks in a society that continues to oppress them. These risks can even be matters of life and death, right? So, like, as a Black woman, I wake up in the morning and I live in a very white world. So I constantly have to sacrifice things like my comfort, my reputation, energy, time, and more, just because I am a Black woman. So being an ally is an intentional choice. This is a privilege in and of itself, because marginalized groups don't have a choice when it comes to being marginalized, but you have a choice on being an ally and standing with them. So importance of allyship, right? So by using the power and privilege of our different social identities, we're able to level the playing field. Marginalized people will not get as far by speaking solely for themselves because they lack certain powers and privileges, nor is it fair to expect oppressed groups to fight for their liberation alone. So I know, because there are some preconceived notions about different marginalized groups. So, like, there's the false notion of, like, the angry Black woman, and that may hinder me in a specific space from people listening to what I have to say, and just having an ally that's also fighting for what I'm fighting for makes sure that the job gets done. So another reason why allyship is really, really important is because none of us are free until we are all free. This came from The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, which I think it's so beautiful that this was one of his main arguments. So we all have a stake in dismantling the systems of oppression. So, for example, both the oppressed and the oppressor suffer from oppression, albeit not to the same extent at all. So women battle misogyny or sexism, men battle toxic masculinity. Both stem from patriarchy, and both have a stake in dismantling this system. So Black people battle racism, white people battle white guilt. Both stem from white supremacy, and both have a really huge stake in dismantling white supremacy. So this is where we're going to talk about how to be an effective ally, right? So I want to start out by saying that Black people aren't a monolith, and well, race is not the only place that you can show up as an ally. You can be an ally in many different forms. So whoever you're standing up for example, like, women aren't a monolith, and may require different things and have different opinions on how you can show up for them, or what they need, and it's based on context. So this is just some things to be aware of, but this doesn't mean that the person in one context it will work, but these are just really some general rules that are safe to say that they will work. So to be a true ally, you have to act, right? Action is so important. Do not be passive. So you have to confront and interrupt oppression when you see it, and show up and speak up. You have to listen. So always trust marginalized people's lived experiences, and do not invalidate or gaslight them in any way. You have to learn. So educate yourself about privilege and structures of oppression. For example, just by watching this workshop is one part of being an ally, right? It's like you're learning about systems of oppression, reflecting on your privilege. Never be afraid to ask questions, be curious, and do your own research, right? Do not expect that oppressed groups or marginalized people have to also educate you on the systems of oppression. That's something that you should take on yourself, but always feel free to ask questions when it's appropriate. And yield. Be aware of how much space you're occupying, and resist the urge to save people. So marginalized groups shouldn't always be at the forefront of this work. Sometimes you can't even be next to marginalized groups at this work. Sometimes you do need to be in the back holding it down, or doing kind of like the grunt work, because it has to be marginalized people that are at the forefront making this change. So we're also going to talk about things to be aware of as an ally. So being an ally, accomplice, or co-conspirator is not an identity. And I think personally what I see as the danger to this is that when you have an identity, it comes naturally to you. You don't really have to think about it. So it's very hard to criticize yourself, right? So I fear that if you think of allyship as an identity, then you are not going to hold yourself accountable, that you're not going to do the constant work to self-evaluate. And we also have to see allyship is not should not be performative. So really beware of performative allyship and ally theater. So don't think of it as a way to like increase your social capital by doing the bare minimum. So it has to be a sincere devotion to the cause. So an example of performative allyship, so when everything was happening a couple months ago with Breonna Taylor and all those protests were happening, people were posting black squares on Instagram for Blackout Tuesday, which is fine. That's totally acceptable. But not doing anything else to be active and show up for Black people during that time is performative, right? So there are multitudes of things that you can do. You can donate, sign petitions, educate yourself. But if you only post a black square, that's when it becomes performative, because you're not actually doing the grunt work to show up for Black people. I also think that people with marginalized identities do not need saving. No one needs a white savior at all, or whatever, for whatever person you're showing up with, because people should still have their own dignity, right? You're just helping out and trying to bridge the gap. And do not stop if you make a mistake, right? Because this work, it needs to be done. And all hands needs to be on deck if we're going to see long-lasting change. So for this presentation and for this workshop, I really wanted to know what marginalized groups on people desire from allies on campus. So I went on Instagram and put out some polls, and these are 3 themes that emerged from what oppressed Williams students had to say. So I saw 3 themes emerge, which is visibility, action, and accountability. And these are direct quotes from these Williams students. And what I'd like to say about like visibility, I think it's really important that you acknowledge the Black people on campus, right? Like that you listen to them, that you see them, you make eye contact, that you're just friendly. I think that's just part of being like a good person. And also someone commented that like in a class, when the topic of race or whatever comes up, that you don't isolate them, right? That you just carry on with the conversation, not making sure that they have to speak and they have to speak solely. Action is also very important, and that's pretty much like what allyship is. It's like action. So always stand with people, speak up for them, and make sure that you hold not only yourself but others around you accountable. Oh, well, perfect. Accountability, right? So taking accountability for your past mistakes, whatever you've done in the past, and not using racial slurs or saying the wrong, or trying not to say the wrong thing if you can help it, and just not doing the wrong thing, right? Not harming oppressed groups. Sorry. So I also acknowledge that I was constantly hearing these contradictions when it comes to being an ally, which can be very hard. So I wanted to flesh them out and really speak about them in this presentation. So knowing when to step up and step back takes practice and reflection, and depends on context, right? So here are some tips for knowing when to step up and step back. And sometimes you have to do both, sometimes just one. It really depends on the context. And like even in the same context, 1 minute you'll have to step up and the next you have to step back. So always be thinking about that. So step up. So step up when you hear inappropriate comments made about marginalized group, when you hear racial slurs or derogatory terms, when you hear or see a microaggression or a macroaggression. And what I'd like to say about microaggression is you're not always going to know why they're wrong, right? Because what makes them a microaggression is the fact that it's very it's very sly. You're not always gonna see like where the harm is gonna be done, but when you hear something, you usually I usually have a reaction to it. I think mine is like a very bodily reaction where I'm like, oof, like I feel it that it's wrong, and sometimes that's okay. Just to say you hear a microaggression whether it's, for example, like, oh, like your English is so good, like yes, that's a compliment, but you also feel it and you also know that might be wrong. You don't have to know the reason, but just by telling the person, oh, like, I don't know why this is wrong, but I just know it's wrong. Let's try not to say that, and maybe trying to speak ask someone at the Davis Center or the person that was said to why it's wrong, and do research on it to make sure it doesn't happen again. So back to step up. When a marginalized person is being excluded or harmed, so that's when to intervene or step up. And before asking questions, assess if it is the right time to ask, right? So a myth I always hear about stepping up is that it is the only way to be an effective ally. That is not true. So stepping back is also active and intentional and is also very, very important to allyship. And the golden rule to stepping up is silence allows oppression to continue. If it feels wrong, say something and do something. So now we're shifting gears to stepping back. So step back when oppressed groups are speaking about their experiences, when it is a topic or subject you know nothing or very little about, when your questions are being answered, be engaged, that's when to step back and learn. So a myth I hear about stepping back is in a conversation about isms, the oppressed group should not contribute. This is not always true. In fact, I know as a Black woman that if we're talking about racism, for example, I do want white people to speak up, right? Because it is a learning opportunity for all of us, right? So even if it's something about like just simple as acknowledging the privilege that you hold, is still really important to the conversation. But a golden rule for stepping back is it is not about you, right? So you might be uncomfortable at times, but again, like it's not about you. It's important to always put the people that this work is meant for at the forefront. So, and it is also really important to practice all of these in different spaces, academic and social. So anywhere from Peresky to Hoxie, always think about this and be an effective ally. So allyship in practice. So I have some examples of allyship and questions to consider. We'll also go in the next slide where we will flesh out some of these examples. So some examples of allyship is the 1859 John Brown raid. It is known as the dress rehearsal for the Civil War. So I don't know if you guys remember this from history class. John Brown kind of raided an arsenal and tried to free some slaves and take over the arsenal. But he actually his sons died from all his efforts, and I believe that he also died from it. So that's an example of an ally putting themselves at harm. Sometimes it doesn't have to be this what's the word, like extreme, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So we also have the 1940s German hiding Jews from Nazis. We've also learned about the Holocaust and all of that, and that's an example of how I have a historical allyship. We have the 1968 Olympics Black Power Salute, which we'll talk about in the next slide. In the 1977 Disability Rights Sit-In, I was so excited when I found this example. So in 1977, a lot of people with disabilities hosted a sit-in because they wanted some acts to be enlisted in our legally, for example, like having ramps everywhere, and just certain rights that we take for granted today. And the Black Panthers, who had very little resources themselves, provided protesters at the sit-in with food and other supplies, which I think is just incredible and is a way that them showing up for people who need it, which I find extremely beautiful. And we have the 2015 Bree Newsome and James Tyson removing Confederate flag over South Carolina's State House. So Bree Newsome is a black woman, and James Tyson is a white man. So James Tyson wanted Bree Newsome to be the one pulling the flag down, which is like metaphorically and so beautiful, like this Black woman taking this symbol of hatred and racism down. His job at that point as a white ally was to protect her, so he was hugging the pole at the bottom, and that's another way of physical harm, because he's the first person that if something were to happen would be harmed, right? So like if the police officers came, like he would be the first one to be handcuffed. So he's at that moment he's doing two things. He is stepping up, right, by even being there and trying to get this flag down, but he's also stepping back and realizing that Bree Newsome had to be at the forefront of this work. So some important questions to consider and when you're thinking about allyship is always think about who is missing from the room or conversation and why is that a problem. I remember talking to a staff at Williams, and he was talking about being in a committee and realizing that there were no women in that room and how that instantly made him uncomfortable, because that meant that there was a very important voice missing, and whatever decision made wasn't going to be effective for like half the population. So also think about, how can I amplify folks who hold marginalized identities, and how can I work with folks who share my privilege to do the same? So it's amazing if we can have one or two allies, but if we can have millions and trillions, it just makes the work a lot easier and get done a lot faster. So some examples of allyship, these are on the left, we have a modern example. This only happened, I think, a month ago during the protest. But as you can see, white protesters form a shield to protect Black protesters from the Louisville Metro Police in a demonstration asking for justice for Breonna Taylor. So again, like, these white protesters are putting themselves in direct harm by forming a shield, but also they're using their privilege, right? Because compared to, as we all know, compared to a Black person, they're least likely to get harmed by police officers. And then on the right, we have the 1968 Olympics Black Power salute. And I don't know if you guys know Bilal Ansari, but he loves this example, and I put this in for him, and I was so excited to learn about it. As you can see, this is a pretty historic image. I see it every once in a while on social media, but you see two African-American athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, each raise a black glove fist during the playing of the U.S. national anthem. And while I would love to talk about these phenomenal Black men, this portion of our story is not about him or them. So it's about an Australian silver medalist, Peter Norman. Everyone on this in this image is wearing, well, not everyone, the three men are wearing human rights badges on their jackets. And this was Peter Norman's idea, actually, to just show that, like, he supports Black people. But you can also see that, like, while he is stepping up, he's also stepping back, and he's not raising a fist. He's allowing the Black men to raise their fist, right? And that's a very amazing example of, like, both stepping up and stepping back. And there were a lot of consequences for Peter Norman. Like, he was never able to go to another Olympics because Australians did not support what he did. So his career was pretty much ruined just because of this act, just because he wanted to show up for Black people, which is an amazing example of being an ally. So we're getting towards the end of our workshop, but these are all the activities that we're going to talk about. One is scenarios. So really think through these questions and what you would do as a student and as an ally, like what an ally should do in these circumstances. So Aseel, I don't know if you want to go through some of these.
Sure, I can read them, and then I'll also say that, you know, the Davis Center is here as a resource to think through these if you'd like to, and, you know, we're always available for debriefs about this training and others. But these are just some scenarios that, you know, that we think might come up for you at your time at Williams, or have come up for different generations of Williams students. So a student in your class who identifies as a woman keeps being interrupted. What do? You hear your white friend say the N-word while singing to a rap song in Hoxie. And for incoming students, you will know what Hoxie Street is. It's a street in Williamstown where a lot of students live together. Your friend that identifies as a woman is scared to walk back to her dorm alone. After a non-binary student in your class has made their pronouns clear, your professor continuously misgenders them. In your class, the professor speaks very softly, and you know there's a student with hearing difficulties in your class. And then any other scenarios. So I'm sure you all have scenarios that you've witnessed or experienced, right, or heard about from others. And we hope that this training workshop allows you to start thinking critically about how to take action, right, as an ally in these different scenarios and other ones you may come up with. But we just wanted to introduce them to you all. These are ones that, you know, Shiara has come up with, but we, again, are always here to debrief them and talk in more specific detail.
Thank you. So another activity, in the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the power and privilege shield. So again, I love that metaphor. I just think it's very beautiful. And came up with this activity to do on your own. So on the shield, write down the privileges you hold and reflect on how they protect you on campus, at home, and the world at large. On the sword, brainstorms ways that you can fight back on systems of oppression and support marginalized students. So think of examples that demonstrate different levels of engagement and risk, and being in versus like example, like we talked about the difference between ally, accomplice, and co-conspirator, and just like think about all these and how they might play into this example. So I do have a worksheet, and I yeah, so if you need access to that too, you can contact the Davis Center, or it might be in
We'll link it.
page.
Yeah,
We'll
we'll
link
put
it.
it online.
Yeah, so you have access to the activity of this, and you can do it your own and learn. I think it's a very beautiful metaphor, and again, it's part of being an ally is part of learning and really of reflecting on your privileges and how you can show up for others. So these are my references for this presentation/workshop. So we came to the end. Thank you so much for staying and learning and reflecting with us. If you have any questions, come see us at the Davis Center. You can contact Bilal, Aseel, me, anyone at the Davis Center, and we would be eager to talk to you. We offer workshops on inclusive awareness, microaggressions, social identity, community building, calling out versus calling in versus calling out. And we serve students through one-on-one or group advising and mentoring. As a community engagement fellow, I have office hours too, so if you'd like to come to that and talk. And we offer resources on inclusivity and much, much more. So we're very eager to talk to you, and whichever place on your education on social justice is, we will meet you where you're at. And yeah, just thank you so much for being here and listening to us.
Thank you so much, Shiara. I'm gonna clap for you. Before we jump off, I have a couple of questions for you that I'd love to get your thoughts on. So we know that when you talked a lot in terms of allyship. Well, there's two questions. Let me start with the other one first. So we talked about allies, we talked about accomplices, and we talked about co-conspirators and kind of how they're different and also how they're the same, right? And maybe why some of them, like accomplices and co-conspirators, why those terms have been created to maybe challenge the ways in which maybe allyship can become complacent or can become passive. And so I'm wondering, like, in thinking about what one wants to strive to be, I want to strive to be the best ally that I can be. And so is there particular value to being one over the other? And are they like kind of stepping stones, or how should we think about those three terms, understanding that people have different ideas about each of them?
Right. So, and during research, some people do think it is a stepping stone, like it is an arrow. Like you start as an ally, then you go to accomplice, and then you go to co-conspirator, and that's perfectly okay, because part of this movement is that we're all going to have different opinions. But personally, in here at the Davis Center, we do believe that really these terms are just, as long as you're doing the work, these terms don't really matter, or like it's just about showing up. So yet, like, you can call yourself a co-conspirator, accomplice, an ally, but as long as you're doing the work, that's really all that is important. So it's not really about like getting a badge for being a co-conspirator or a medal. It's just about showing up and doing the work. And really, I love what Bilal said, but when people see you show up, they will come up with a term for you, and it will be affirming and endearing, and you will love it. So
that's really helpful. Thank you, Shiara. My other question is, we know that when we want to learn about privilege and marginalization and oppression, which you went through and explained to us what those terms mean, we don't turn to folks with marginalized identities to explain those things to us, right? We don't turn to those folks to be the ones who educate us, right? We seek education on our own and with other folks. But it seems that from your presentation, like, with allyship, it's a little different, because in order to be an effective ally, you have to know how to ask folks that you're showing up for how they want, like, us to show up for them, because we have a lot of examples that you shared with us about all the different ways in which you can be an ally, and some people have been allies in the past, right?
Mhm.
But it can you kept emphasize that it's different based on context. So do you have any suggestions for how we can ask folks, or tips like in how to ask folks the ways in which we can be allies for them, like just phrasing, or how we might, bring that conversation up?
Right. I really love that you're saying that. I think it's so important to ask. Like when you're in doubt, when you have any questions, just ask. Um, I would say first making sure it's the right time, it's the right
Hmm.
context. So
Hmm.
always like preface by saying like, oh, like, do you have some time? Like, is it okay if I can talk to
Hmm.
you at this moment?
Hmm.
Um, and just like not being equivocal about it, just like
Hmm.
how can I show up for you, how can I be an
Hmm.
ally. It's just as simple as that, and making sure that the person can actually talk to you at that time, because time is money.
Yeah.
And it's totally okay if they say no too, like if they're busy,
Yeah.
or then go to another person, like someone at the Davis Center who is
Of course.
literally paid to answer your questions. um, so yes, never be afraid to ask questions. Just understanding that it depends on the time, and phrase it just like that. Like, how can I show up for you? How can I be an ally for you?
I love that phrasing.
Mhm.
uh, Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yara. Thank you for all the work that you've done on this. Thank you to everyone who bore with us through the technical difficulties. Hopefully everything was clear, and you could hear us clearly. But please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Like I mentioned earlier, this training will go up on our website, and you'll be able to access it anytime. You'll have access to all the activities, and the PowerPoint as well. So there's no need to like take notes or anything on this. You'll have access to everything, and we're always available to talk about this at any time, and we welcome the opportunity to do so. And for our incoming students, welcome. And for our continuing students, we're so glad that you're able to experience this new workshop and training with us. So I'm going to close this down, stop the recording, and we thank you again. And thank you, Shiara, for your amazing presentation.
Of course.